If you like our video, click the button to subscribe to our channel and get easy access to new content. To see our full suite of ad-free video courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides, visit us at www.teachucomp.com. The Brush Settings panel in Photoshop lets you change all the settings of the currently selected painting tool in Photoshop, like the brush tool, for example. To show or hide the brush settings panel in Photoshop, click the Toggle the Brush Settings panel button in the Options Bar Control panel. If this button doesn't appear in the Options Bar Control panel for the currently selected tool, then the tool has no brush settings you can change. To set the texture settings of a brush stroke in Photoshop, click the Texture Brush setting. Doing this also enables this brush setting. Texture brush settings in Photoshop let you apply a texture, also called a pattern, to the individual brush tip marks within a longer brush stroke or the brush stroke itself. These settings also determine how that texture appears and how it mixes with the brush tip and/or brush stroke. To apply a brush texture in Photoshop, click the Click to Open Pattern Picker button to show the Pattern Picker panel as a drop-down panel. The Pattern Picker panel shows the default pattern groups and any custom patterns you have created within it. The pattern groups appear as folders in the Pattern panel. You can click the arrows next to the pattern group folder names to expand and collapse them to show or hide the patterns within them. Then click to select the pattern to apply to the brush stroke within the Pattern Picker panel. As you select patterns, the patterns then appear in a recently selected patterns list at the top of the Pattern Picker panel. To close the Pattern Picker panel after selecting a pattern, click the Click to Open Pattern Picker button again to close it. When you apply a pattern texture to a brush, paint is applied to the pattern based on the lightness or darkness of the tones in the pattern. Practically speaking, either the lightest areas or the darkest areas in the pattern receive either the least amount of paint or the most paint, depending largely on your selected blending mode. However, to invert the current tonality pattern, which inverts the paint applied to the dark and light tones in the pattern, check the Invert checkbox next to the Click to Open Pattern Picker button. To change the scaling percentage of the texture within the brush stroke or brush tip, use the Scale slider or enter a percentage into its adjacent field. To adjust the brightness of the texture, use the Brightness slider or enter a value into its adjacent field. To adjust the contrast of the texture, use the Contrast slider or enter a value into its adjacent field. To apply the texture to the individual brush tip marks in the brushstroke versus the entire brushstroke, check the Texture Each Tip checkbox. If checked, this setting also then enables the depth jitter and control settings, which you will examine momentarily. To choose the blending mode for blending the brush and texture, select a choice from the Mode dropdown. To set the texture depth, which affects the visibility of the pattern within the stroke, use the Depth slider or enter a percentage into the adjacent field. A 100% depth value makes the pattern fully visible. A value of 0% completely hides the pattern. Note, however, that if you check the Texture Each Tip checkbox to apply the pattern to the individual brush tip marks, then you may need to increase the spacing of the stroke in the brush tip shape settings to see the pattern appear in each brush tip mark. which tend to overlap within a single brush stroke. If you apply the pattern to the individual brush tip marks by checking the Texture Each Tip checkbox, to then set the amount of random change to apply to the depth for each brush tip mark, use the Depth Jitter slider or enter a percentage into its adjacent field. To set what, if anything, determines the dynamic control for the depth setting, select your desired choice from the Control dropdown. Choices include off, fade, pen pressure, pen tilt, stylus wheel, and rotation. If you select fade, then enter the steps for the fade depth into the field to the right of the Control dropdown. Each step is usually one instance of the brush tip mark within the larger brush stroke, unless you change the brush tip count per step within the scattering brush setting. Then use the minimum depth slider to set the minimum brush tip depth percentage or type a value into its field. For all choices other than off, which disables dynamic control of the depth, simply set the minimum depth value. Remember to click the subscribe button to see more of our videos. See our full suite of courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides at www.teachucomp.com.